I tell you, a smile goes a long way. I can be hot and sweaty and miserable, but when that person looks at me and smiles, and in their smile they're saying thank you, it doesn't get any better than that.
One of the definitions of the verb impact reads, to have a strong effect on someone or something. The Vietnam War had an impact on our veterans. A handful of these veterans returned to Vietnam and had an impact on the people of Vietnam. The people of Vietnam then, in turn, had an impact on these veterans. Welcome to the By War and By God podcast. I'm your host, Kent Williamson. This show is a companion series to the award-winning documentary film By War and By God. And, by the way, I'm very pleased to announce that just this week, we won another one. We picked up the Best Documentary Short Film Award at the Bare Bones International Film and Music Festival in Muskogee, Oklahoma. Thank you, Bare Bones. This season on the podcast, we've been telling the remarkable accounts of people whose lives were forever changed by the Vietnam War. You've heard stories of heroism and stories of tragedy. And soon we're going to hear some amazing stories of reconciliation, which, of course, is the result of a magnetic force that tugged and pulled and eventually drew these soldiers, medics, machine gunners, and crewmen back to Vietnam for the purpose of serving some of the poorest of the poor in that beautiful country. But before we jump into today's episode, let me tell you about Big Heaven Cafe. Big Heaven Cafe is the online store for Paladin Pictures. It's the place to go to purchase any of Paladin's films, including your copy of the documentary By War and By God. So please click your way to BigHeavenCafe.com. That's BigHeavenCafe.com. And use the coupon code PODCAST to save $5 on By War and By God. And remember that 20% of all sales of By War and By God from Big Heaven Cafe go to the nonprofit Vets with a Mission, the group that since 1989 has taken nearly 1,400 Vietnam veterans back to Vietnam for healing and reconciliation. Today we'll learn about the amazing impact of Vets with a Mission, and we'll also learn about the impact that the impact has had on those doing the impacting. Of your 7 trips back to Vietnam with Vets with a Mission, what would you say is your best memory?
Well, the best memory is the first trip.
This is Pat Cameron.
The Lions Club had given me about 10,000 pair of eyeglasses and quite a few pair of sunglasses. And we were going to start seeing patients, and I was going to go through all the eyewear, separated the men's and ladies and children, and I was going to be able to try to match that prescription up as close as I could and provide them with some eyewear so they could read and see. I had this feeling that, maybe something cool, something neat's going to happen. Maybe the Lord's going to do something to really show me a miracle. Here I am asking for a miracle, and it's my first time over there. Well, it's 5 o'clock their time. We're getting ready. We're seeing our last patients, and the last patient is a 7-year-old girl. Tim came downstairs with her and her mother and said, "I doubt we can do much for her, Pat." And he handed me that prescription, and it was for bottle cap type glasses, about plus 10 power. And he said, "I know you ain't got anything." I went over there, and there was a set of kids' glasses that were bottle caps, plus 10s, within very close to her prescription. And I pulled those out, and I looked at them, and I ain't got no idea how them glasses got in there. And I put those glasses on that little girl, and her eyes were already a little large with the eyewear, but they got huge. And she said something in Vietnamese to her mother, and her mother looked over at me and started crying. And my translator said, "This child has never seen a mother." And she'd never seen anything except blurriness, pretty much light, dark, and blurry. And she could see, she could see leaves. She never seen stars. She never seen her daddy or her sisters and brothers. And if that ain't a miracle, ain't never gonna be one. I sat there and cried with her mother. That life of that child and that family, and maybe that whole village when they heard the stories changed me. that made it perfectly clear to me why I was sent. And that's probably why I've come back so many times. Because I know that every time we go back, we can make an impact. That's the moment that will never leave me. I've told the story a number of times to people, and it's just a cool story. Just a cool story.
Tell me about your best day with Vets with a Mission.
They're all good. It's all good.
This is Steve Scott.
I am most comfortable when I'm hot and sweaty and out in a Montagnard village with people that I know need my help.
A leftover term from the French colonial era in Vietnam, Montagnard means people of the mountain. These indigenous people groups occupy the central highland area of Vietnam. Influenced by French missionaries during the 19th century and American missionaries during the 1930s, many Montagnards converted to Christianity. This caused them to be viewed as suspect by North Vietnamese forces during the Vietnam War. Estimates are that over 40,000 Montagnards fought alongside the American forces. But when America withdrew from Vietnam in April of 1975, these Montagnards were left to defend themselves. As a result, many were put to death by the communist regime, while many others fled the country in an attempt to save their lives.
I am most comfortable when I'm hot and sweaty and out in a Montagnard village with people that I know need my help. Be it a 7-year-old that needs a heart operation, and I'm the guy I do triage, so I see these people first person that sees them. And sometimes I'll have this kid come in with club nails and they're cyanotic, and I know full well they need heart surgery, and I'm the guy that can send them to the doctor and get it started, and we can save that kid's life. So, I mean, that's priceless. I also feel just as good if an old lady comes in and she's got aches and pains, and I can talk to her, and I can speak enough Vietnamese to talk to her and find out that, you know, I can relieve her pain. I can make her feel better when she goes home. So yeah, those are priceless things. So I don't particularly care for the staying in the 4-star hotels or, you know, or any of the tourist stuff anymore. I've been there, done that. I really like to go out in the villages. I suppose if I could do anything I wanted, I'd just be the barefoot doctor who wanders around Southeast Asia with a backpack full of medicine.
I would say my best day in Vietnam is probably one of the hardest days in Vietnam.
This is Jim Proctor.
I was working security. Again, it's a communist country. They pretty much decide who can come in and who can't come in, and they have to have the right paperwork and everything. And it was very tough when you could see the desperation in some of these people's faces, that they wanted to get in and they wanted to see the American doctors, and they had an issue and they wanted to get healed. We could only let certain people in, and that was very tough. And there were sometimes that there were ladies that looked like they were in their 80s, certainly maybe in their 60s and 70s, crawling over barbed wire fences or trying to get over the gates with the little pointed arrow type things that are to keep people out, and actually having to pick them up and put them outside of the gate because they couldn't get in. And that was tough, but at the same time, that is something that has stuck with me. It really affected how I felt about it, and the desperation, and can relate to that. And so while that is probably the toughest day, I think it was one of the best in the fact that it really humanized that for me. We're affecting people's lives.
The people who were able to take advantage of what we were offering had been invited by the Vietnamese government to come. They had to have it as an invitation only. And this lady showed up and she didn't have an invitation.
This is Bill Steele.
She had a little baby with her, a little girl that was probably a year and a half old that was sick. And she wanted medical attention for this child, and she saw me and she knew I had to be somebody because I obviously wasn't Vietnamese. And she came up to me and she approached me because we couldn't communicate language-wise, but she helped me to understand that she needed medical attention for her child. And I felt I was able to take her to one of the Vietnamese doctors and explain the situation and get the child looked at. And it was so heartwarming, I think, to be able to do a little something that was perhaps above and beyond the call of what we were supposed to be doing there.
What would you say is your best experience with Vets with a Mission? But first, do you know that you can go to Vietnam with Vets with a Mission? Yes, you. Whether or not you're a Vietnam veteran, whether or not you're a medical professional, you can experience some of the thrill of serving, of caring for the people in the rural villages of that beautiful country. Learn more about the upcoming trips at vetswithamission.org and start making your plans today. All right, back to the show. What would you say is your best experience with Vets with a Mission?
My best experience with Vets with a Mission.
This is Cal Dunham.
As strange as this sounds, the joy of carrying a little old lady or a man or a little boy that needs to get up the stairs to see the doctor or get down the hallway to see the doctor in the clinic, of picking them up and holding them to get them where they need to get if they can't do it on their own, and they just look at you and smile. I tell you, a smile goes a long way. I can be hot and sweaty and miserable, but when that person looks at me and smiles, and in their smile they're saying thank you, it doesn't get any better than that.
As you recall from last episode, in the early days of the organization, Vets with a Mission helped build a therapy pool for a polio orphanage in Saigon. This is Roger Helly.
We met a couple that were married with 2 children.
Both the husband and the wife had polio.
And there was just something about that was actually the husband. You know, here he is, he's got polio, his children did not. So I asked them, you know, where they met, and they had met at the orphanage when they were children.
The same orphanage in Saigon where Roger had been years before.
For years now, I carry little happy face stickers in my pocket, and so I looked at them. I said, when you were a child, do you remember some Americans coming to your orphanage? And I held up one of the little stickers, and both of them, their eyes just got big, and they said yes. And you know, I said that was us. And you know, just the fact that full circle 20 years later, you know, that because of an act of kindness, you know, we couldn't share the gospel in words. You know, I think it was Francis of Assisi said, preach the gospel, and if necessary, use words. And while we could not use words to share the love of Christ, we did it in acts of kindness. And here was that couple 20 years later, you know, that had come full circle, and we had come full circle as a ministry. And that was probably one of the most exciting days that I can remember. You know, he had the same smile that he had when he was a 10-year-old kid. And 20 years after we met them as children in a polio orphanage, now here they had a personal relationship with Jesus Christ and married and in the church that we were supporting. God has an incredible sense of bringing things to your awareness, you know, to let you know that what you're doing is making a difference.
What's the best memory of your experiences going back?
Wow. I guess my best and most impacting memory going back was the first trip.
This is Phil Carney.
We were out at Marble Mountain. We had come into a real large village full of people. It occurred to me that during the war, something really significant had happened in that village, or near that village. What had happened back in 1970 when I was there was we were out on a small operation, and we had stopped to have lunch, and our squad leader had told us to break out chow, sea rations, and so on, and I had a can of sea rations in my hand.
Sea rations, or Type C rations, were pre-cooked individual meals ready to be eaten out in the field, straight from the can. Other types of rations include A rations, meals for troops that are prepared with fresh, refrigerated, or frozen ingredients. B rations, meals for troops prepared with canned or preserved ingredients. K rations, which contained 3 meals to cover an entire day and provided up to 3,000 calories for airborne troops, tank corps, and other mobile units. And D rations, which were chocolate bars designed with the help of Hershey's chocolate not to melt.
And I had a can of sea rations in my hand. And I remember just sitting on my helmet and looking at this can of sea rations, and this old mama-san had found her way, and she got up behind me and she tapped me on the shoulder, and it just startled me. And I remember standing up and spinning around, and I had that can of sea rations in my hand, and I was so angry at her because she scared me and startled me. And I, just out of my anger and frustration, I took that can of sea rations and I threw it at her. And I hit her right in the chest. I hit her as hard as I could with that can of sea rations. And she just crumbled right in front of me, knocked the breath out of her. And I remember she reached and grabbed that can of sea rations, picked it up, got back up on her feet, bowed and said thank you, and hobbled off. It was one of those moments where you go, boy, you didn't know that was in you. So in 1989, on my first trip back to Vietnam, we're in this village near where this incident happened in 1970. And all of these people are coming out of the village and they're figuring out these are Americans and they were here during the war. I remember a lady came out that would have been our age now, but she worked in the laundry on the Da Nang Air Base during the war. And all she could remember was English slang words from the war, from the 60s. And I remember her running out and trying to communicate with us, and she was saying, "You are groovy, you are psychedelic, Jimi Hendrix, far out, man." And those kinds of things were going on, and everybody was having a moment. And many of these Vietnamese were coming out and they were presenting us with things they had kept from the war. The flag. Remember, one person came out and gave a chevron, a corporal, rank of a corporal chevron to one of the guys that this person had had since the war. And the best thing that happened to me on any of the trips was in that moment, and there were hundreds of people everywhere, and it was such a God moment that a lady came up to me, and this lady handed me an old, empty, wore-out can of sea rations. And she handed it to me. And I remember standing there looking at that, and that moment was the most incredible moment. It couldn't have been more real if Jesus himself had been standing there and handed me the can of sea rations. It was if I went back in time to 1970 when I was an 18-year-old kid standing there and doing what I did. That was without a doubt the best day and the best trip with Vets with a Mission. That was unforgettable, and it was a very healing moment.
In Vets with a Mission's early years, the Vietnamese government, although closed in some areas and restricted in others about religion or faith being shared by Americans, would let Vets with a Mission do things in exchange for medical team assistance or the building of a health clinic. Here are a few of those stories.
We were traveling with a van driver across the Mekong River into a fairly remote part of Vietnam called Bac Lieu.
This is Dave Carlson.
This van driver had been chosen by the government. He was not to interact with us. He was really only there as a perfunctory. We have to have somebody driving us. And he was Buddhist. And he would stand by the side as we'd make our rest stops, and we'd go in and we'd get a bottle of water. And we'd be laughing with the people who were selling. We'd be telling jokes as best we could. Human interaction. And we're driving, and the translator comes up to me, grabs me by the collar, and says, "This man wants what you have." I said, "He wants my money?" He says, No. This man wants whatever joy it is that's in all of you in this van. He's been driving for years. He has never seen people with such joy on the inside that they would somehow release everything in their life and just pour love out to other people. The van driver wants that. And I said, he's in luck. We've got a van full of pastors. We've got pastors here who can... And the translator pulled me by the collar and says, "No, he wants you to tell him what it is that's going on." I'm a CPA. I don't do this for a living. Okay, fine. And we talked about Jesus. And we talked about the joy that will fill your life as you release the tensions of this world and turn it over to Him. Anyway, the van driver said, "We must pray." And I'm watching the traffic coming at us, and I go, yeah, I'd like to do a little prayer right now. I want to pray that we survive. He says, no, he wants you to pray with him now to help him accept Jesus. I go, I am not worthy of this. This is nothing I've done. This is my friends. They're more qualified. No, it's you. And so we prayed while driving what seemed to be 130 miles an hour between mopeds in this van for this man to accept Christ. And I was overwhelmed, but that was an amazing experience. The last one I'll tell you about, we were meeting with the underground church in the Mekong River. At that point in time, the Vietnamese government was not friendly toward the Christian church in general. And so this particular church would bring floating barges out into the middle of the Mekong and lash together. And they would float down the Mekong River and have their services. And then they'd disperse so that the local authorities wouldn't be involved. And we come zooming up in this little skiff, and we've got 6 or 7 pastors on board, and we're going to get to meet with this underground church. And several of them are going to get to bring the message. The translator comes up, and he grabs him by the collar and says, "You will speak." And I said, "No, we've got qualified people here. They've come thousands of miles. They're here to preach." He says, "No, you will preach." And I'm thinking, Lord, what are you doing? And I reached back to something I remember as a kid, and I stood up there and began to talk about that when you make a commitment, it's got to be public, and that it's going to cost you something. You may have a family that's not agreeing with your personal beliefs. It's going to cost you something with them. You've got a government that does not really want these beliefs to be spread among its people. It's going to cost you something. And here we are in this boat right now, and we're safe. But if you do decide to turn your life over to Christ, the commitment is going to be real, and it's going to cost you something. But the benefits far outweigh anything you can even imagine. Well, I don't know what the translator said. I have no idea what he was actually teaching these people, and maybe he never translated a single word. And I know that whatever words I had didn't come from me, because I said, "Lord, it's yours." I have no idea. I should be telling these people how to file their income taxes. But at that moment when we got done, they began to rise up. And the translator turned to me and said, "They want to be baptized." I'm going, oh my goodness. He says, "You will get in the river and baptize them now." And I said, "Okay, I'm drawing the line, guys. I've got 6 pastors sitting here who've come 10,000 miles to have this experience. And I don't know why I'm here right now, but you have got to let these men baptize these people." 200 people got off that boat that afternoon and were baptized in the middle of the Mekong River. And I just sat down and I cried. I just cried. I never thought I would have an opportunity to be involved in ministry. Never thought I'd have an opportunity to share my faith. Never thought I would see anything. And yet, for whatever reason, I was given an opportunity to see an incredible sight. It is one of the defining moments of my life. And I would say that was the best.
What was your best day going back? What was your best memory?
One of my favorites is probably one where Joette and I had met a Vietnamese woman, young woman, really was my wife's friend.
This is Chuck Ward.
We kind of befriended her. She had a shop near China Beach. So we became friends with her, particularly my wife. The friendship grew into almost like family over 8-9 years. And of course, we shared the gospel with her when we could. I tried to do it mostly by example, and Joette was able to just share things with her, woman to woman. And one time, during a difficult time in her life, she asked me a lot of questions about Jesus and about this faith we have, being a Christian. And I knew a Vietnamese pastor from America who happened to be in Vietnam at the same time as I was, and he was in Da Nang. And I asked him to go by and talk with her, because I thought she was ready to hear the gospel. That was early in the day, and later that day in the afternoon, Joette and I went to Ho Chi Minh City, Saigon. And we're at a grocery store on the second floor of the Tax Trade Center buying some snacks and things, and we get a call on our mobile phone. And it's our friend, and she's crying. And between the sobs, she proceeds to tell us that she's just been baptized in the river in Hoi An, and she has come out of the water, and she just can't stop crying. She feels so good. Well, Joette and I start crying right there in the grocery store, and this Vietnamese staff person comes up to me and says, "Sir, I'm sorry, is there something I can do? What is wrong?" And I didn't know what to tell her. I didn't want to tell her that this person had accepted Christ because I didn't know what kind of person she was, or if she was a government person. And I remember I said, "No, everything's okay. I'm just happy that I found the Oreos."
Thank you for listening to this episode of the By War and By God podcast from Paladin Pictures. You can learn more about By War and By God at bywarandbygod.com. Don't forget to use the coupon code podcast at bigheavencafe.com to save $5 on your copy of the film. You can also watch By War and By God for free if you have an Amazon Prime account. You can find me on Facebook or Twitter. Just search for Kent C. Williamson, and while you're there, search for By War and By God and like or follow us. Please email your thoughts about the show to Kent at bywarandbygod.com. The film will screen on Friday, May 5th at the International Christian Film Festival in Orlando. I hope to see you there. The By War and By God podcast is written and produced by me, Kent C. Williamson, with sound design and finishing by Ashby Ratchford. Our audio engineer in the studio is Steve Carpenter. Thanks also to my brother Brad Williamson, who helped record the interviews in today's episode. The By War and By God soundtrack was composed by Will Musser, and for a limited time you can download the soundtrack for free at bywarandbygod.com. Thank you to the entire Paladin team, which includes Leslie Wood, Steve Carpenter, Dan Fellows, and Ashby Ratchford. This podcast is a production of Paladin Pictures. Yep, Paladin is a film production company that sees the value in audio podcasts. Why? Because like is the case with By War and By God, the podcast can go deeper into the story than the film ever can. Paladin Pictures is committed to the creation of redemptive entertainment and thought-provoking cultural critique. Learn more about us and our films at paladinpictures.com. That's Paladin, P-A-L-A-D-I-N, pictures.com. By War and By God is produced at the Paladin Studio in the amazingly wonderful, beautiful little town of Charlottesville, Virginia. And of course, thank you to our veterans, those who returned, and especially those who didn't, like my wife's Uncle Floyd. Thank you. Next week on the By War and By God podcast.
I have seen reconciliation with former enemies where we have sat down at a table for dinner together. VC, NVA sitting on one side of the table, and a bunch of us sitting on the other side of the table. We all had a mission, but now, quite frankly, we're just a bunch of old farts sitting there having a beer together and talking about the old days.
Mr. Somm had a wooden leg, and Mr. Somm, I asked him how he lost his leg, if he lost it in the war, and he said yes, that he got shot by a machine gun. And then I told the interpreter, I said, I'd like to tell Mr. Somm that I might have been the one that shot his leg off.